The old cargo ship Silver Wind drifted toward the giant space station. Its engines hummed softly, and the dull gray hull showed years of service. Inside, the crew prepared for another routine maintenance job. The mission was simple: fix air filters, clean certain bays, and leave before the station's official guards got impatient. Dan sat on a metal crate in the cargo bay, pulling on his work gloves. He was not a soldier or a hero. He was a maintenance technician who preferred quiet jobs, working with machines rather than people. Space stations were all the same to him: big, loud, and full of important people who didn't notice the ones who kept things running. His friend Malik, the crew's senior engineer, checked the work orders on a small data pad. Dan, you'll take the East Wing storage area. Looks like it's been neglected for months. Try to be quick. The client here is some big deal in the Jirani Empire. They don't like people wandering. Dan shrugged. Fine. Storage rooms are easy. The Silver Wind docked with a soft thud against the station's magnetic locks. As the airlock opened, the crew stepped into the polished halls. The air smelled faintly of metallic oil and something floral. Tall alien guards in silver armor watched them with blank expressions. They had sharp, angular faces and bright silver, eyes that reflected the light like mirrors. Dan kept his head down, walking past them without a word. He followed the digital map on his wristband, weaving through narrow corridors. The further he went, the quieter it became. Soon he reached the East Wing. The storage room door slid open with a hiss. Dust floated in the air, glowing under the pale lights. Inside were racks of weapons, shields, and armor. Dan frowned. Weird. Looks more like an armory than a storage room. The work order didn't say anything about this being special, so he assumed it was just a backup weapons room. He began by moving crates aside and wiping down the surfaces. His eyes were drawn to a tall stand at the center of the room. On it rested a black set of armor with a faint blue shimmer. It was beautiful in a way that made him pause. The plates were carved with symbols, and the helmet had a smooth, curved crest, like the fin of a bird. Dust clung to its surface. Without thinking too much, Dan took a cloth and began to wipe it clean. The black metal shone brighter with every pass of the cloth. The blue shimmer deepened, almost as if the armor responded to his touch. Dan didn't notice how much time had passed. Then he heard it, the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps in the hall. They were not the casual steps of a worker. These were slow, steady, and full of authority. The door slid open again. A tall figure stepped inside. She was unlike any Jirani Dan had seen before. Her armor was silver and gold, polished to perfection. A long, dark blue cloak trailed behind her. Her silver eyes were brighter than the guards outside, and her presence filled the room. Dan froze, still holding the cloth against the armor stand. The woman stopped just inside the doorway. Her gaze moved from his face to the gleaming armor before him. For a long moment, she said nothing. The silence felt heavy, like the air had thickened. Finally, she spoke in a calm but sharp voice. "Do you know what that means?" Dan blinked. What means?" She took a step closer, and the room seemed smaller. "You touched it. You cleaned it." "I thought it was just dusty equipment," he said quickly. "I was told to clean this room." Her eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice remained level. "This is not equipment. This is the sacred armor of the Jirani throne. It has not been touched by anyone outside the royal bloodline for decades." Dan felt his stomach drop. I didn't know." She studied him, as if deciding what to do. Then she stepped forward until she was only a few paces away. "In our tradition, when one cleans a ruler's armor, it is an oath. A pledge of service, loyalty, and protection. You have done this in front of the throne itself." Dan opened his mouth to protest, but closed it again. He could tell from her tone that this was not something she was joking about. "You are human?" she continued, tilting her head slightly. "Your people are not part of our empire, yet you have performed a rite that binds warriors to their queen." Dan realized with a jolt who she must be. The posture, the cloak, the way the guards outside had been so still. "You're the queen." "I am Queen Asera of the Jirani Empire," she said simply. Dan's mind raced. He was just a technician. He had no weapons training, no political knowledge. Yet here he was, standing in front of an alien queen, accused, or maybe honored, for polishing her armor. A faint smile touched her lips, though her eyes stayed serious. "By our laws, you are now my champion, my sworn defender until the bond is broken, which can only happen by death or by the Queen's word." Dan felt his throat tighten. There's been a mistake. I'm not a fighter. I just fix machines." Her expression did not change. "Mistake or not, the bond is made." She turned toward the door and gestured for him to follow. "Come, we will speak in the Hall of Blades. There you will learn what it means to stand by the throne." Dan hesitated, glancing once more at the armor he had cleaned. It now gleamed as if lit from within. Whatever he had stepped into, it was no ordinary job anymore. With a deep breath, he followed the queen out of the room, unaware that the choice he made in that dusty storage chamber would change his place in the galaxy forever. The hallway outside the storage room was wide, lined with banners of deep blue cloth embroidered with silver stars. Dan followed Queen Asera in silence, his boots clicking softly against the smooth black floor. 2 guards in silver armor walked. Behind him, their eyes fixed straight ahead. The air felt cooler here, and every step seemed to echo. Dan wanted to ask questions, but he could not find the right words. He had just learned that he had somehow agreed to be a royal champion without knowing it. The Queen's calm stride made it clear she expected him to keep up, so he did. They reached a set of tall double doors carved from dark metal. The doors swung open without anyone touching them, and Dan stepped into a huge chamber that took his breath away. The Hall of Blades was a circular room with high walls lined with hundreds of weapons. Swords, spears, axes, and strange curved blades rested in careful arrangements. At the center of the hall stood a raised platform where a long, ceremonial table stretched from one side to the other. Bright white light shone down from a circular opening in the ceiling, making the silver and steel weapons glimmer. Queen Asera stopped near the table and turned to face Dan. "This is where we honor the warriors who protect the throne. You will stand here now, because you have taken the oath." Dan raised his hand slightly in protest. "Your Majesty, I did not know about this oath. I am not a soldier. I work with tools, not weapons." The Queen regarded him quietly for a moment. "Do you think only those who are born to fight can defend a throne? The greatest champions in our history were not all warriors at the start. Some were farmers, healers, or builders. But the moment they accepted the bond, they became something more." Dan shook his head. "I didn't accept anything. I was just cleaning. I didn't even know whose armor that was." One of the guards, behind him, stepped forward. "My queen, the rite is ancient and binding. The armor has accepted his hand. The shimmer on the plates is proof. He is now linked to the throne until you release him." The Queen's silver eyes locked onto Dan's. "I will not release you. Not yet. You touched the armor with care, without fear, and without being ordered. That speaks of a certain spirit, perhaps not the strength of arms, but the strength of heart, and sometimes that is worth more." Dan felt a tight knot in his chest. "Even if I wanted to serve, I wouldn't know how. I can't fight like your guards. I wouldn't last a minute in battle." "You will learn," Queen Asera said simply. She gestured toward the weapons on the wall. The Jirani way is not only strength of body but sharpness of mind. Your people are known for adapting to the unknown. I have heard stories of humans turning desperate situations into victory through resourcefulness. You will be trained in our combat style, but you will also keep your human way of thinking. That is why I will keep you as my champion." Dan rubbed the back of his neck, feeling both trapped and strangely curious. "What exactly does a champion do?" The queen stepped closer, her cloak sweeping the floor behind her. "A champion stands at the ruler's side in times of danger, speaks on their behalf in trials of honor, and fights in challenges brought by rivals. You will guard my life, my reputation, and the stability of the throne. It is a role of honor and risk." Dan's stomach sank. "So, people might try to kill me?" "Yes," the queen said without hesitation. "But they will try to kill me first. You will be there to stop them." Dan stared at her, unsure whether to laugh or panic. The queen's expression was steady, as if she was stating a simple fact, not a threat. One of the guards stepped forward with a small silver tray. Resting on it was a thin black band shaped like a bracelet. The queen took it and handed it to Dan. "This is the mark of the champion. Wear it on your left wrist. It will allow you access to the inner halls of the palace and alert my guard to your location at all times." Dan held the band carefully. It was smooth, almost warm to the touch, as if it had been sitting in sunlight. Reluctantly, he slipped it onto his wrist. The band tightened just enough to fit snugly, and a faint blue light pulsed from its surface before fading. "It recognizes you now," Queen Asera said. "If you remove it, the bond is broken, and you will be exiled from all Jirani territory. But if you keep it, you are under my protection." Dan looked at the band, and then at her. "And if I fail, then we both fall," she replied calmly. The weight of her words made him feel colder than the air in the hall. Still, something about her confidence made him think that maybe she knew exactly what she was doing. She turned and gestured for him to follow again. "Come. You will be taken to the training hall. My masters will see what you can do. Tomorrow, you will begin your duty." They left the Hall of Blades and walked through a series of smaller corridors. Dan's mind spun, with thoughts of what this meant for his life. Yesterday, he was worried about fixing broken fans. Today, he was apparently responsible for protecting an alien queen. The training hall was enormous, with a smooth black floor marked with silver lines. At the far end, a group of Jirani warriors practiced with long, curved swords, their movements fast and graceful. The air smelled faintly of metal and a sweet herbal scent from the incense burning in the corners. A tall warrior with scarred arms approached. His eyes were the same bright silver as the queen's, but his expression was harder. "My queen, this is the one?" "Yes, Master Vec," the queen said. "He is my new champion. Teach him our ways. See if he can survive the week." Vec's gaze swept over Dan from head to toe. "He is small, soft," Dan bristled. "I can hear you." The queen's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Good. Keep that spirit, human. You will need it." Without another word, she turned and left the hall. Dan stood there, surrounded by alien warriors who could likely crush him in seconds. Vec tossed him a wooden practice blade. "Show me how you hold it," Vec said. Dan caught it awkwardly. "Like this?" Vec shook his head. "No. Like this." He stepped forward, adjusting Dan's grip and stance. "If you are to guard the queen, you must first learn not to fall in the first strike." Dan took a deep breath. This was not the job he had signed up for, but for reasons he could not yet explain, he felt a spark of determination. Maybe, just maybe, he could figure out a way to survive this. The training hall felt colder the next morning. Dan woke early, but he had barely slept. His thoughts had been tangled all night, full of questions about the queen, the armor, and what being a champion actually meant. He had never imagined his life would lead to something like this. Master Vec stood in the center of the hall when Dan arrived. The tall warrior wore light practice armor and held a long wooden staff. Around him, several Jirani soldiers were already sparring, their weapons clashing in a steady rhythm. The scent of incense hung in the air again, mixing with the faint metallic smell of the floor. "You are late," Vec said as soon as Dan stepped onto the training floor. Dan checked the time on his wristband. "It's still early." "Early. For you? Late for me?" Vec replied, tossing him a practice sword. "You will begin with the basics: grip, stance, and footwork. Without these, you will be nothing more than a target." Dan caught the wooden blade, feeling its weight. He tried to hold it like he thought a sword should be held, but Vec shook his head. The master stepped closer, adjusting Dan's grip until the handle rested firmly in his palm. "Your hands are too tight," Vec said. "You will tire before you strike. Relax, but do not loosen your hold." Dan tried again, this time feeling the balance of the sword. His stance was clumsy, and his feet moved too close together. Vec corrected him again, making him shift until his weight was centered. "Better," Vec said. "Now attack me." Dan hesitated. "You mean swing at you?" "Yes," Vec said firmly. "Do not think. Just move." Dan stepped forward and swung. Vec blocked it with one hand and pushed him back easily. "Too slow," Vec said. "Again." They repeated the drill over and over. Each time Dan tried to be faster, stronger, or more unpredictable. Each time, Vec countered without effort. Sweat began to run down Dan's back. His arms ached, but he refused to stop. One of the other warriors watching gave a quiet laugh. "The human will not last a day." Dan heard it, and his jaw tightened. He swung again, this time feinting to the side before striking. Vec blocked it but raised an eyebrow. "That was different," Vec said. "You thought of that yourself?" Dan nodded. "I just guessed what you might expect, then did the opposite." Vec studied him for a moment. "Your kind's unpredictability may be your only advantage here. Use it." The morning training continued with footwork drills, blocking practice, and quick dodges. Dan stumbled more than once, but each time he got up quickly. By the time they stopped for water, his shirt was damp with sweat, and his breathing was heavy. As they rested, Vec walked beside him. "You must understand the bond you carry. Now, this is not a simple job. Cleaning the queen's armor was not just a task. In Jirani culture, the act is sacred." Dan wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "She told me it means I'm her champion, but I still don't get why it's such a big deal." Vec nodded slowly. "The armor of the ruler is more than metal. It carries the spirit of the throne. When a person outside the royal bloodline cleans it, they are telling the entire empire they will carry the honor and danger of defending that throne. It is a promise that cannot be taken lightly. If you fail, it is not only your life at risk, but the stability of the queen's rule." Dan took a sip of water, letting the weight of those words sink in. "So, if I mess up, it's not just me in trouble, it's her too." "Exactly," Vec said. "Which is why you must become stronger. You do not have the years of training we do, but you have something else. Your way of thinking. The Jirani fight with precision and tradition. You can fight with surprise." After the break, Vec introduced Dan to the other warriors. They were wary, some even cold, but a few offered small nods of respect after seeing him train without giving up. One of them, a younger warrior named Rin, stepped forward. "Human, let us test your reflexes." He tossed a small metal ring into the air without warning. Dan instinctively caught it before it hit the ground. Rin's silver eyes brightened slightly. "Fast. Good." The rest of the day was filled with more training, lifting weighted staffs, practicing quick turns, and memorizing basic Jirani combat forms. Each movement felt foreign at first, but Dan began to notice patterns in how his opponents moved. The Jirani were disciplined, but they often repeated the same attack sequences. By evening, Dan's muscles felt like they were made of stone. He left the training hall and was escorted to his new quarters. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a desk, and a window looking out into the endless black of space. He sat on the bed, removing his boots. The Black Champion's band on his wrist pulsed faintly once, almost like a heartbeat. He wondered if the Queen could see where he was right now. Before he could rest, the door to his quarters opened. Queen Asura stepped in, her cloak flowing. Behind her. "You trained well today," she said. Dan stood quickly. "I'm trying, but it's a lot to take in." "It will be more tomorrow," she replied. "Master Vec tells me you think differently than my warriors. This is good. You must keep this. Never try to be exactly like them. Be human." Dan nodded slowly. "Why me, though? You could have just said it was a mistake and let me go." The Queen's silver eyes met his. "Because the Empire needs more than tradition right now. We are surrounded by enemies who expect us to act as we always have. You are not like us, and that may be our advantage." She turned toward the door, but paused. "Rest well, champion. You will need your strength." When she left, Dan sat back down, staring at the window. Somewhere out there, enemies of the Jirani Empire were planning their next move. And somehow, by cleaning a piece of armor, he had been pulled into the middle of it. 3 days had passed since Dan began training under Master Vec. Each day started before sunrise with strength drills, followed by hours of weapon practice. His arms were sore, his legs ached, and his palms were rough with new blisters. Still, he refused to give up. Vec pushed him hard, but also seemed more willing to speak now. "You are improving," the master said one morning after a sparring session. "Not enough to win against our champions yet, but enough to survive longer than I expected." Dan gave a small grin. "I'll take that as a compliment." That afternoon, training was interrupted by the sound of the great palace horns. The deep notes echoed through the hall, making the warriors stop in mid-practice. Dan looked around in confusion. Vec's expression darkened. "That is the summons of challenge. Stay close to me." They left the training hall quickly. The corridors were busy with guards moving in formation toward the throne room. The air felt charged, as if a storm was coming. Dan's heart beat faster. When they arrived, the throne room was already crowded. Queen Asura sat on her high seat, her silver eyes fixed on the center of the chamber. Standing there was a tall alien dressed in red armor trimmed with black. His face was sharp and cold, and his voice carried easily across the hall. "I, Lord Sarek of the Krith Dominion, challenge the rule of Queen Asura," he declared. "By the ancient code, I call for the trial of blades. Let her champion face mine in combat to decide her right to rule this sector." Murmurs ran through the crowd. Dan felt a rush of heat in his chest. He already knew what this meant. If he was truly the Queen's champion, the fight would fall to him. The Queen's voice was steady. "The Krith Dominion has no claim here. Yet if you seek the trial, you shall have it. My champion will face yours." Lord Sarek smiled thinly. "Very well. The trial will be held tomorrow in the arena. Your champion will not survive." Dan's throat went dry. He leaned toward Vec and whispered, "He's talking about me, isn't he?" "Yes," Vec replied without hesitation. Dan tried to swallow the lump in his throat. "I'm not ready for this. I've been training for 3 days. Vec's eyes stayed on the center of the room. "No warrior is ever truly ready for their first fight. But you must face it." The Queen rose from her throne, her voice ringing. Across the hall, "It is decided. Tomorrow, the trial of blades will decide this matter. Let all witness the outcome." The crowd bowed as she left the chamber. Dan followed with Vec close behind. When they reached the Queen's private hall, she turned to Dan. "You look troubled." Dan tried not to sound panicked. "Troubled? I'm about to fight someone who probably has years of combat experience. I'll be lucky to last a minute." The Queen stepped closer. "Do you think I would allow you to fight if I thought there was no chance? You are human. Your ways are different. That is your strength. Sarak's champion will expect you to fight like a Jirani. Do not. Surprise him." Dan rubbed the back of his neck. "That's a good plan, but I don't even know what I can do. Yet?" Vec spoke. "You know enough. You can move, you can strike, and you can think faster than you realize. Tonight, we will train you in one tactic. You will use it in the arena." The rest of the day was a blur. Vec drilled him in sudden sidesteps, quick feints, and attacks aimed at weak points in armor. Over and over, Dan repeated the movements, until they felt natural. His arms ached, but the master gave him no rest. By nightfall, Dan could barely stand. Vec handed him a cup of cool water. "Tomorrow, you will not fight to overpower. You will fight to outthink. That is how you will win." The next morning, the arena was full. Thousands of Jirani citizens filled the high stone seats. The air was loud with cheers and the sound of drums. The arena floor was a wide circle of smooth black stone. In the center, two warriors would fight until one yielded or could no longer stand. Dan stood in the shadowed entrance, wearing light armor shaped to fit his human frame. The black champion's band on his wrist pulsed once, as if reminding him of the bond he carried. Across the arena, Lord Sarek's champion entered. A huge figure in crimson armor, carrying a heavy curved blade. His movements were slow but full of power, like a predator that knew it could crush its prey. A voice announced the start of the trial. "By the ancient code, let the champions decide the fate of the throne." The signal was given. The red-armored warrior came forward with a heavy swing. Dan sidestepped quickly, remembering Vec's training. He darted to the left, forcing his opponent to turn. The crowd roared at the unexpected speed. The opponent swung again, faster this time. Dan blocked with his wooden practice in mind, letting the impact slide off his blade instead of meeting it head-on. He stepped back, giving himself room. For several minutes, they circled each other. Dan avoided most strikes, only attacking when he saw an opening. He used feints, pretending to move one way before striking from another. Each time, the red warrior grew more frustrated. Finally, Dan saw it, a small gap under the opponent's right arm. As the warrior lifted his blade for a heavy strike, Dan rushed forward, jabbing his weapon into the opening. The hit was not deep, but it was enough to make the larger fighter stumble. Dan did not waste the chance. He struck again, pushing the opponent back until the red warrior dropped to one knee. The arena fell silent for a moment, then erupted into cheers. The signal was given. The fight was over. Dan stood, breathing hard, sweat running down his face. The Queen stepped onto the arena floor and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You have done well, champion." Lord Sarek's face was cold as he turned away. His challenge had failed. Dan realized his legs were shaking, but he kept standing tall. For the first time since this began, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could be more than a technician. The sound of the crowd still echoed in Dan's mind as he walked through the palace halls that evening. His body ached from the fight, but his thoughts were sharper than ever. The trial had ended in victory, yet it was clear this was only the beginning. Queen Asera had said little after the arena, only that she would see him the next morning. Now, Dan returned to his quarters where Master Vec was waiting. "You fought well," Vec said, his voice steady. "Not perfect, but well enough to win." Dan gave a tired smile. "I'll take that. I'm just glad I'm still standing." Vec studied him for a moment. "That fight has earned you respect, but also enemies. Serac's failure will not be the last challenge the Queen faces. From now on, your training will be harder. You must be ready for opponents who know you are dangerous. The next morning proved Vec's words true. Training began before the first light touched the palace towers. Dan was taken to a different hall, larger than the first, with high ceilings and walls lined with strange metal shapes. "This is the Hall of Trials," Vec explained. "Here, you will face different scenarios. Not all threats are a single opponent in an open arena. Sometimes danger comes in shadows or in numbers." The first exercise was a maze of shifting walls. Dan was given a blunt sword and told to reach the other end while 3 warriors tried to stop him. The twisting corridors forced him to think quickly, listening for footsteps and predicting movements. He used distractions, throwing small pieces of metal to draw attention away from his path. By the end, he reached the exit with only a few light strikes taken. The next challenge was endurance. Dan had to hold a shield against repeated strikes from 2 warriors. His arms trembled, but he focused on staying balanced, letting the shield absorb the blows instead of resisting them directly. When they paused for water, Rin, the younger warrior who had tested his reflexes before, approached. "You are quicker now," he said with a small nod. "I did not think you could be." Dan smirked. "Neither did I." For the next week, every day was the same: early mornings, intense drills, and endless repetition of techniques. Dan learned to switch weapons mid-fight, to fight while moving backward, and to use the environment for advantage. But it was not only fighting. Queen Asera also summoned him to meetings with her advisors. She explained that a champion must understand not just the blade, but the mind of the enemy. Dan listened as she spoke about trade disputes, border skirmishes, and subtle warnings of unrest in certain sectors. One evening, after such a meeting, the Queen dismissed her advisors and spoke to Dan alone. "You have done well in training, but there is something you must know. Serac's challenge was not an isolated act. There are whispers of a coalition forming, rival rulers who see me as weak because I chose a human champion." Dan frowned. "So they'll keep testing you." "Testing us?" "Yes," Asera said. "And if they believe they can break you, they will come without warning." Dan thought for a moment. "Then maybe we should make them believe I'm more dangerous than I really am." The Queen's silver eyes glinted. "That is the human way, is it not? To make the enemy see what you wish them to see." Over the next days, Dan began training with that goal in mind. Vec designed drills that highlighted speed and unpredictability. In sparring matches, Dan was encouraged to take bold, risky moves that made his opponents hesitate. By the end of the second week, the warriors who had once looked down on him now treated him with a mix of caution and respect. Rin even asked to train beside him, saying, "Your style is strange, but it works. I wish to learn it." Dan laughed. "It's called guessing and hoping I'm right." But beneath the humor, he felt the pressure building. His victories in training and the trial had raised expectations. If he failed now, it would be seen as proof that the Queen's trust was misplaced. Late one night, as Dan walked back from the training hall, he noticed a shadow move near one of the side corridors. He slowed his steps, listening. A faint sound, like metal against stone, reached his ears. Without thinking, he stepped toward the noise. The corridor was dim, lit only by a few wall lamps. At the far end, a figure in dark clothing slipped through a door. Dan followed quietly. The door led to a storage chamber, smaller than the one where this all began. Inside, the figure was crouched, over a crate, placing small silver discs along its side. Dan recognized the objects from one of the Queen's meetings. Proximity charges, explosives. He stepped forward, blade drawn. "Drop it." The figure spun, revealing a masked face with silver eyes. A Jirani, but not in palace armor. For a moment, they stared at each other. Then the intruder lunged. The fight was fast. Dan dodged the first strike and swung low, knocking the attacker off balance. The masked figure recovered quickly, but Dan used the cramped space to his advantage, forcing them back against the crate. With a quick movement, he disarmed them and pinned them against the wall. Guards arrived moments later, drawn by the sound of the struggle. The attacker was taken away without a word, and the charges were removed. When the Queen heard what happened, she came to see Dan herself. "You stopped an assassin tonight," she said. "You acted without hesitation. That is what a champion must do." Dan shook his head. "I just happened to be in the right place." "No," the Queen said firmly. "You were aware. You noticed what others did not. That is why you are here." As she left, Dan felt a strange mix of pride and unease. He was learning fast, maybe faster than he had thought possible. But the danger was growing just as quickly. He looked down at the black band on his wrist. The bond that had started by accident now felt heavier than ever, and he was beginning to understand just how much it truly meant. The palace was quiet as night fell. Outside, stars sparkled in the dark sky like distant fires. Inside, Dan stood in the Queen's chamber, the weight of the Black Champion's band on his wrist heavier than ever. Tomorrow, everything would change. Queen Asera entered, her silver eyes calm but fierce. "The enemy's forces gather near the border," she said. "They plan to strike at dawn. This will be the final battle." Dan nodded. "We have prepared as much as we can, but I'm still not sure I'm ready." The Queen smiled softly. "You are more ready than you know. You have the heart of a champion." That night, Dan barely slept. He thought of the journey he had taken, from a simple technician cleaning armor to the defender of a great empire. His training, the trials, the battles, they all led to this moment. At first light, Dan stood with Master Vec and Rin outside the palace gates. Hundreds of soldiers gathered, ready to fight. The Queen's guards, the city's militia, and even some of the alien allies joined them. The air was tense, filled with the sounds of armor clinking and weapons being checked. Dan's heart pounded as he looked to the horizon where the enemy approached, dark shapes moving like shadows across the fields. The battle began with a thunderous roar. Energy blasts lit the sky. Dan moved forward with the Queen's forces, his sword steady in his hand. He remembered Vec's lessons. Fight with your mind, not just your strength. Enemies charged in waves. Dan dodged and struck, weaving through the chaos. At one point, he found himself face to face with a soldier who wore armor similar to the attackers from the cave on Talaris. The soldier lunged, but Dan used a quick feint and knocked the weapon away. With a swift move, he disarmed the enemy and pushed him back. Around him, the fight raged on. Suddenly, a shout went up. Queen Asera's voice rang out. "The enemy's leader approaches! Protect me!" Dan saw her surrounded by dark figures. Without hesitation, he rushed toward her. His steps were sure, his sword raised. He reached the Queen just as the enemy leader struck a powerful blow. Dan blocked it, the force shaking his arms. The leader was strong, but Dan remembered his training, the human unpredictability. With a quick twist, Dan slipped past the leader's guard and struck at a weak point in his armor. The enemy staggered, surprised by the move. The Queen moved beside him, her own blade flashing. Together they pushed the enemy leader back until he fell to his knees. The battle slowed as the enemy forces began to retreat. Cheers rose from the Queen's army. The threat was ended, for now. Dan lowered his sword, breathing hard. Queen Asera placed a hand on his shoulder. "You have done well, champion. Today you proved that strength comes from the heart and the mind." Dan looked around at the faces of the warriors and citizens. He was no longer just a human far from home. He was part of something greater, a protector of an empire. The Queen smiled. "Rest now. Tomorrow the work of rebuilding begins." Dan nodded, feeling the weight of the black band less heavy than before. He had faced the impossible and stood strong. The bond was not just a duty, it was honor. The palace was quiet as night fell. Outside, stars sparkled in the dark sky like distant fires. Inside, Dan stood in the Queen's chamber, the weight of the Black Champion's band on his wrist heavier than ever. Tomorrow, everything would change. Queen Sarah entered, her silver eyes calm but fierce. "The enemy's forces gather near the border," she said. "They plan to strike at dawn. This will be the final battle." Dan nodded. "We have prepared as much as we can, but I'm still not sure I'm ready." The Queen smiled softly. "You are more ready than you know. You have the heart of a champion." That night, Dan barely slept. He thought of the journey he had taken, from a simple technician cleaning armor to the defender of a great empire. His training, the trials, the battles, they all led to this moment. At first light, Dan stood with Master Vec and Rin outside. The palace gates. Hundreds of soldiers gathered, ready to fight. The Queen's guards, the city's militia, and even some of the alien allies joined them. The air was tense, filled with the sounds of armor clinking and weapons being checked. Dan's heart pounded as he looked to the horizon where the enemy approached, dark shapes moving like shadows across the fields. The battle began with a thunderous roar. Energy blasts lit the sky. Dan moved forward with the Queen's forces, his sword steady in his hand. He remembered Vec's lessons. Fight with your mind, not just your strength. Enemies charged in waves. Dan dodged and struck, weaving through the chaos. At one point, he found himself face to face with a soldier who wore armor similar to the attackers from the cave on Talaris. The soldier lunged, but Dan used a quick feint and knocked the weapon away. With a swift move, he disarmed the enemy and pushed him back. Around him, the fight raged on. Suddenly, a shout went up. Queen Sarah's voice rang out. "The enemy's leader approaches! Protect me!" Dan saw her surrounded by dark figures. Without hesitation, he rushed toward her. His steps were sure, his sword raised. He reached the Queen just as the enemy leader struck a powerful blow. Dan blocked it, the force shaking his arms. The leader was strong, but Dan remembered his training, the human unpredictability. With a quick twist, Dan slipped past the leader's guard and struck at a weak point in his armor. The enemy staggered, surprised by the move. The Queen moved beside him, her own blade flashing. Together, they pushed the enemy leader back until he fell to his knees. The battle slowed as the enemy forces began to retreat. Cheers rose from the Queen's army. The threat was ended. For now, Dan lowered his sword, breathing hard. Queen Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "You have done well, champion. Today, you proved that strength comes from the heart and the mind." Dan looked around at the faces of the warriors and citizens. He was no longer just a human far from home. He was part of something greater, a protector of an empire. The Queen smiled. "Rest now. Tomorrow the work of rebuilding begins," Enar nodded, feeling the weight of the black band less heavy than before. He had faced the impossible and stood strong. The bond was not just a duty, it was honor.